Dark Souls and Demon Souls are really unique when it comes to video games. There really aren't any other games you can compare them to, or any genre you can label them as, since they basically created their own, Souls-like. It's obvious that these games are becoming increasingly more influential in the gaming market, as other Souls-like games not developed by From Software have started to appear. I like to see the emergence of the Souls-like genre, much like I see the emergence of the roguelike genre. Demon Souls would be like the original Rogue, the game that started it all, while Dark Souls would be like NetHack, the game that greatly expanded the genre and introduced many things people take for granted within the genre today. I would now like to look at these two games, Dark Souls and Demon Souls, from an analytical perspective, to see how they differ and what similarities there are, all while speaking in this monotone Swinglish voice. I will also mix things up a bit with my own opinion on the matter, and then decide which one I think is superior. But first of all, let's look at some differences and similarities. In order to compare the two games, I may have to do a quick recap on how the games work and play. Just so you know, I won't call these games RPG dungeon crawlers as some people like to call them. I think it's rather misleading, as the term RPG is already very inconsistent in the gaming world, and it's hard to pinpoint what it even means. Instead, my description is going to be very literal, and as a result may be a bit bland. But at least you'll know what I'm talking about. Dark Souls and Demon Souls are games controlled from a third-person perspective, set in a medieval fantasy setting. You select your starting class, find weapons, armors and spells, and kill enemies. This probably sounds very standard to you if you have any experience with a typical Western RPG. But what differentiates the Souls games from the rest of the crowd are two things: its storytelling and its general design. In the Souls games you get very little exposition, and you'll remain confused about what's going on until you've pieced the story together yourself. Most information about things is found through item descriptions, and all the holes and inconsistencies in the story are places where the player's own interpretation comes into place. So what do these games really do differently, and which one is superior? Let's start comparing.
The demons hunt down men and claim their souls.
The most striking similarity of these games are the settings. They both take place in fantastical medieval worlds approaching or in the process of an apocalyptic end. Let's analyze the stories, shall we? In Demon Souls you get an opening cinematic explaining how King Alan XII of Boletaria used the soul arts to bring prosperity to his kingdom. This awakened the Old One, who with its great demons devoured the souls of the kingdom's inhabitants, and a great fog swept across the lands. Many heroes braved the fog but never returned, and this is where the player steps in. The game starts with the player traversing the fog, and eventually finding their way through by a guiding voice. The guiding voice comes from the Monumental, a half-living sentinel trying to keep the world together. Upon arrival in Boletaria, the player is almost immediately crushed by a great demon. The player later finds himself revived in soul form, in a place called the Nexus. It's here where the guiding voice came from, and your soul will be trapped there until all of the demons have been vanquished. It turns out you're not the only one trapped there, as many adventurers before you have fallen for the same trick, and are now stuck in the Nexus. It really sets the tone of the entire game, both by addressing the hopelessness of the situation, but also that things at first aren't really what they seem. If you don't give it too much thought, it may all seem like you're doing it for a good cause, but if you think about it, you're actually a slave to the Monumental. From the Nexus, you can access different parts of Boletaria through archstones. But if you die, you get the message, the Nexus traps you, and you shall remain in this world as a soul forever. The Monumental basically have you on a leash, and the only way to free yourself is to do its bidding, to lull the Old One back to its slumber and rid the world from demons. Considering the difficulty of this game, it may seem like an impossible task for a new player, and some heroes of the Nexus have even fallen into madness because of it.
Who are you? I don't remember anything.
What are you doing? Even I will not just sit back and take it.
It's a great way to use the game's mechanics to tell the story, and make you understand the struggles of the characters, since they are also going through the same things. The difference, of course, is that you're behind a screen holding a controller, and these characters are actually experiencing the horrors personally. Now let's look at Dark Souls. Much like Demon Souls, Dark Souls starts with a cinematic, which explains the events leading up to the main game. This time around, the dragons rule the above. The above is grey and without form, while in the below there was fire, and with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, light and dark. 4 beings claim the souls of lords found within the flame. Nito, the first of the dead, the Witch of Izalith, Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and the furtive pygmy, each representing death, life, light and dark respectively. With their newfound souls, they challenged the dragons of above, until the dragons were no more. Thus, the Age of Fire began, and Gwyn's kingdom prospered for a time. But all fires must eventually fade, and when the game starts, there are only embers. As the fire died down, humans became branded with the dark sign, making them undead and preventing them from dying, but instead causing them to slowly go hollow, losing their sanity and becoming mindless. You see, the human soul is dark, and as fire fades, darkness grows. The game starts with the player locked in a cell. The player is locked away for carrying the dark sign, but in this prison there are no guards, as the undead curse is inevitable and all humans will eventually be cursed, which means that even the guards have been branded with what they were supposed to stop. You're let free by a knight called Oscar, who is releasing all the prisoners in hope that some of them will be sane enough to carry out the undead prophecy, which goes like this.
Thou who art undead art chosen, and thine exodus from the undead asylum maketh pilgrimage to the land of ancient lords. When thou ringeth the bell of awakening, the fate of the undead thou shalt know.
Oscar tragically dies, and it's now up to you to fulfill the prophecy. As you arrive in Lordran, the land of ancient lords, you're greeted by a crestfallen warrior.
Well, what do we have here? You must be a new arrival. Let me guess. Fate of the undead, right? Well, you're not the first.
Before uttering a single word, he already knows that you're here for the undead prophecy. He knows this because you're not the first. Far from it. To him you're just another fool with a sword hoping to save the world. And up to that point you may very well have thought that you were special, and that the fate of the world really was in your hands. However, all false hope you once had has now been crushed, as you are nothing special in this cruel world. And once again, much like in Demon Souls, it sets the tone for the rest of the game. Other than the example I just mentioned, the insignificance of the player is also addressed very well in the grand scale of things. Many locations you stumble across have been long out of use, and seems to have been designed for people 10 times your size. The state of the world is a result of all-powerful beings trying to stop the world's inevitable end. And now you have to suffer the consequences of their actions. You're just a tiny fly buzzing around in the aftermath of greater things caused by greater beings. As you can see, both Souls games have a consistent theme of hopelessness and insignificance, both in the way of narrative and mechanics. Narratively, because the world is doomed and all the godlike beings have abandoned the world, and mechanically through its sheer difficulty. It's easy to understand why many characters in the game have given up, because everything is so hostile and dangerous to you. And even the weakest enemies can kill you, even if you're maxed out with best gear, if you're not careful. In a way it represents real life a bit, since these games have a steep difficulty curve and many people who play it for the first time give up after a few hours, as did the crestfallen warrior I mentioned earlier.
Well, what are you going to do? I've already decided. I don't really care. I'm simply crestfallen.
Something that all Souls games have in common is that the story is always cyclical. Whenever you complete the game and sit through the end credits, the game starts over with the same character with the same stats. This is of course just the player ascending into New Game Plus, but from a story perspective it represents an alternate universe where things occur differently. You see, whenever you wander around in these games, you see the ethereal forms of other players. This is mechanically just a representation of what other players are doing at the same time as you, to kind of show that you're not alone in this. But from a story perspective, it's an alternate universe where the same events have occurred, but is centered around a different person. It's also clear that the events of the games have happened before, as the Monumental of Demon Souls even tells you about the last time the old one caused destruction. And if you also play Dark Souls 2, you can see that the Age of Fire and Age of Darkness have occurred many times in a cycle-like pattern. The story of the games don't differ very much when it comes to overarching themes. It's more the events in the game that differ, but it always contributes to the sense of hopelessness and despair I mentioned earlier. So instead of discussing what the differences are, one should instead discuss which game does it better. This is of course opinion based, but personally I think they do it equally well. Whenever I discuss the story and the lore of each game, I don't have a preferred one, but rather enjoy discussing them equally. When it comes to the overall game design, the differences become a lot more apparent. The games may appear very similar to an observer, but if you play the games you'll notice the differences quite easily. The most striking difference are the visuals. Even though both games use the same graphics engine and basically have the same character models, I can always instantly tell the games apart just by looking at the screenshot. The reason for this is that Demon Souls have more color, yet is darker. Each area have its own color scheme, but unless you're next to a light source, it's still pretty dark, with an exception of the slight yellow light radiating from the player. Not to mention when you're in soul form, which one will probably be for most of the playthrough, in which the character will shine green. While Dark Souls do have certain color schemes related to certain areas, and some places, especially later in the games, are quite colorful, I do feel that Dark Souls is a bit more grey-washed, or rather, there are more natural colors to everything, at least in the beginning. This means that even though Dark Souls have better graphics and more detailed character models, I still feel that Demon Souls look better due to all the color. It's clear that certain areas in Dark Souls are greatly influenced by location from Demon Souls, like how Blighttown is similar to the Valley of Defilement, and also how the Undead Burg is similar to Boletarian Castle. But I've always felt that when the similarities are that apparent, the Demon Souls version has always been prettier to look at. Take the Valley of Defilement for example. It's filled with grime, mud and everything foul, yet at the same time it's brimming with colors like purple, yellow and green. It's like what Selen Villain says.
I find something odd about this place. It brims with grime, but at once feels strangely pure.
Blighttown, on the other hand, is not very pleasant to look at. While it does maintain some color, it's all very brown, and the contrasts are all muddy. This may very well have been intentional, in order to make it feel like the most depressing and grimy place in the whole game, which it certainly is. So in that aspect, it certainly succeeds in setting the tone and atmosphere. In any case, I think my original statement still holds true, and I much prefer the Valley of Defilement over Blighttown. The same thing can be said about Boletarian Castle when you compare it to Undead Burg. Boletarian Castle has a very clear and consistent greenish-blue color scheme, with red and yellow contrasts. But Undead Burg on the other hand have more natural colors, like grey and brown and occasional bits of green. Don't get me wrong though, I think Undead Burg and Blighttown are both brilliantly designed areas, and I'm not hating on them. But I would still say I prefer Demon Souls to Dark Souls based on aesthetics alone. Graphic and aesthetics are good and all, but how does the actual content differ? It would be a good idea to mention that Dark Souls world is a lot bigger than Demon Souls, which naturally means that Dark Souls has more content. But it's the quality that matters and not the quantity, right? First of all, let's talk about bosses. In Demon Souls there's always a boss at the end of each stage, and they're all quite unique from each other. There isn't a single boss that looks identical to another, and the environment is always different, whether it's a 20-meter tall armored knight with dozens of crossbowmen at the surrounding walls, or a golden bird on top of a mindless giant in a crammed room, or a spider shooting fireballs in a narrow corridor. They are all memorable in their own way. Dark Souls on the other hand suffers a bit from reused bosses. The Asylum Demon, Stray Demon and Demon Fire Sage are basically all the same, and the Demon Fire Sage especially could have been completely removed without affecting the game in a negative way. Dark Souls definitely features some great bosses, especially if you include the DLC, but I do think that quality beats quantity on this matter at least. The Gaping Dragon, the Centipede Demon and Orstein and Smough are definitely intense and memorable boss fights, but I think it's the lackluster reused boss fights in Dark Souls that makes Demon Souls superior on that aspect, if only just. When it comes to equipment though, the quantity may be in Dark Souls' advantage. One thing that really bugs me about Demon Souls is the small amount of weapons and armor to be found. About half the weapons in Demon Souls are only available after doing very specific obscure things, and at that point you're about halfway through the game already, which is saying a lot considering its short length. There's even one weapon, the Crescent Falchion, that is available almost right away if you know where to look, and if you're playing as a magic focused character, you won't have a reason to get any other weapon throughout the entire playthrough because it's so powerful. The weapons are also very specific on which kind of character build they work best with, which will make you feel rather limited with your choices. Dark Souls, on the other hand, have tons of different weapons in different categories and subcategories. You usually have plenty of choices when it comes to which weapons will work best with your build, and as a result I have played Dark Souls a lot more due to all the different playstyles that are available. Demon Souls weapons are definitely varied, but it all feels quite bare bone. It's as if the developers had a checklist of what different playstyles they intended the players to use, and made one specific weapon for each style. Dark Souls, on the other hand, gives the players a lot more choice. It's probably because of this very reason that I played Dark Souls more than Demon Souls, regardless of all the things that Demon Souls does better. Speaking of which, let's talk about the enemies. If you played both games, it will be obvious that some enemies in Dark Souls are heavily based on enemies from Demon Souls. Hollows, knights, skeletons, giant mosquitoes and the like. If it wasn't clear already, I do think that Demon Souls did these enemies better for the most part. The hollows in Demon Souls convinced me a lot more that they were mindless beings, and that is due to the sounds they make, their animations and the attacks they use. The Demon Souls hollows bouncing around just sounds more convincing than the Dark Souls hollow. The walking animations really makes them look mindless in Demon Souls, but in Dark Souls I always got the feeling that they moved like people trying to look mindless. Lastly, the attacks of the hollows is the final part worth talking about. In Demon Souls they will just wail on you, and even if you're blocking they won't stop. They have similar movesets in Dark Souls, but even the weakest shields will interrupt their attacks, which makes them feel less harmful. The same things can be said about the skeletons. The skeletons in these games will roll around a lot and attack you relentlessly, and in Demon Souls their sheer size makes them a lot more intimidating. Also, the same thing said earlier about the attacks can also apply here, as blocking with a shield usually won't interrupt their attacks, which adds to their intimidating nature. The skeletons in Dark Souls are easier to block, and will even crumble if you hit them hard enough. Sure, they are quite tough foes, but they just don't hold a candle to their Demon Souls counterparts. The one enemy I do think Dark Souls did better would be the Black Knights. In Demon Souls, these knights are about the same height as the player character and grunt loudly when attacking. They also have glowing eyes, which are clearly meant to be intimidating, but giving enemies visible eyes gives them a human touch and as a result makes them less scary. The Black Knights in Dark Souls, however, are really large, don't have visible eyes and never make sounds except when killed. They basically have the exact same movesets, but the Dark Souls ones are less predictable, and combining that with their lack of grunts make them scarier than their Demon Souls cousins. Considering how early you face the first Black Knight and how completely under-leveled you are at that point, you really learn to fear these foes. So far I've only talked about enemies that appear in both games. What about the other enemies? I would say that both games feature equally unique and challenging foes, but it's because of the reoccurring enemies that I've already mentioned where I think the Demon Souls gets the edge. Overall, it's only a slight edge, and I don't think one game is completely superior to the other in that regard. But whenever I play these games back to back, I always get reminded why I prefer Demon Souls in that aspect. But now I would like to talk about the most important aspects of these games. What really makes them different from each other. The overall design. First of all, Demon Souls is very stage focused. From the Nexus you can level up and select which stage you will play, and at the end of each stage there's always a boss. After a boss is defeated, an Archstone will appear, which you can use to teleport back to the Nexus. You can later teleport back to the new Archstone and carry on with your travels. Dark Souls, on the other hand, introduce bonfires. Bonfires will respawn enemies when rested upon, but also works as checkpoints, leveling hubs, and a load of different things later on. This makes a huge difference in how you travel and explore the world, as the entire world is now connected physically, rather than being a number of isolated areas connected by a hub. The world feels a lot more consistent as a result, and it's surprising how varied the areas can be while still feeling naturally connected. Demon's Souls had the advantage of having its 5 different areas being isolated from each other, and as a result had completely different atmospheres. But strangely enough, I don't feel that Dark Souls level variety deteriorated from the previous game. You go through medieval castles, crystal caves, sunken cities, hellish landscape, undead catacombs and cities built for the gods, and it all connects so naturally that it's surprising just how they could cram in so much variety. It may sound that I vastly prefer Dark Souls over Demon's Souls when it comes to the matter, but I will say that both games' world designs have their own charm. I usually compare Demon's Souls world design to Mega Man X, linear, challenging, a few hidden secrets and a boss at the end, while Dark Souls world design on the other hand is more reminiscent of Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Everything is connected in some way, and the game is almost completely based around exploration. The 2 games I mentioned are both great games in their own way, but are vastly different in overall design, where the few things they do have in common includes 2D side-scrolling and platforming. In the same way, Demon's Souls and Dark Souls have the same art style and combat system, but at their very core they vary greatly, and as a result should be judged accordingly. It's not a matter of which game does things better, but rather what you personally prefer. I think that both games are near perfection in what they try to achieve, and as a result I consider them equal in their own way. I will however say that the overall content in Demon's Souls is slightly better than the overall content in Dark Souls. But the sheer size of Dark Souls makes up for it. Demon's Souls was already perfect in what it tried to achieve, so I think that the developers did a good decision in changing the design completely for Dark Souls, rather than reusing the old one, or try to improve what was already perfect. The result was the mastery of a different design, and it makes both games stand on their own as masterpieces. The only reason I would ever excuse you for not playing both is that if you don't have a PlayStation 3, which you need in order to play Demon's Souls. In that case, you should get one, and play Demon's Souls. Now. Do it!